Hey guys, happy Friday. Welcome to our Friday beading class. And I hope you guys are all doing well. I missed you last week for the holiday weekend, and I hope you guys had a great time. But we're back today with something really adventurous. And so I would call it kind of like intermediate advanced, but it's not a hard stitch once you just get that little turn figured out. And then from there, of course, like as always with these projects, you get so many new ideas. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is the basic stitch. And so the basic stitch is going to start with just a diagonal. And that's increasing on the same side and decreasing on the same side throughout the whole design. And it's the easiest one to make and the fastest to learn. But then, of course, if you want to change it up, you can start to change the side you do the increase and decrease on. And I'll show you how to do the little turn. And you can make waves. And as long as you, vary that in the same numbers, you'll get something that looks like a wave, or you could even just do something that looks like this. And you'll recognize a lot of you guys have done what's like a leaf pattern where the two sides come together again. And that's the same stitch. So if you already know that, then you already know this. So then I know that's kind of a very popular design that's out there today, or people like to make those. You can, of course, change up your colors, change up everything, and you'll get different, new, and like unique results every time. All right, so I'm going to show you a closer view of what I have on the mat here today. And so what these are just kind of a stream of consciousness of ideas that I came up with playing with the same stitch in different configurations. And so in the case of this one, it's kind of like a 4-up bead start. So you see it's got 4-up beads on that. And then each side is either a decrease or an increase, and it flows straight through. On this one, it's got one less repeat. So it's 3-up beads, just to make it a little thinner. And so if you were to do those as a bracelet, you'd see they're just a little bit different in height. If you make something to think about is the wider you want your wave to be. Like if you're going for something wider, you would make more counts at your start row. And if you wanted it to be closer together, like a higher frequency wave, you would just make less starts. But for this class, I'm going to stick with the 4 and the 3 just because it's easier and it's easy to remember and get started. And the good news, even though we are doing what seems like kind of like an odd count turn, the start is more of an even count look. So getting started is kind of easier than it would otherwise be if it was odd count. All right, so let's move these on to the side. And I'm just going to quickly introduce what's in the handout. So in the handout, what we've got are the colors I used in the samples, which are a size 8 seed bead and a barley color. This is the Barley Ivory. And then I used an accent bead, a size 11, and a Siver-Lined gold. And those two are here if you like that. You spotted my little rainbow stitched version on the mat earlier. I used a rainbow of 8 seed beads and then an 11 orange on the side. And I'll talk about that when we start building. For findings, you're going to need some way to finish it, depending on what you're doing. At a minimum, you're going to need some jump rings. And then a clasp of your choice. You can use lobster claw, you can use a toggle. This is what's in the handout. And it's what I used here in this one. Came out really pretty. Some optional things you can do, like a little drop with some of your seed beads. So you just need a little head pin for that. I grabbed some of those. And then you will need wire guardians. And those are needed on the ones that have the ending kind of, let me try to explain a little better. So on some of the designs, the pendant mainly, and this bracelet, the end, as you end up wearing it, the ends are actually the upside of the bead, the whole side. So it makes it super, super easy to get your wire guardian on the end there. So that's actually a super, super easy way to end it. It's the same thing on the pendant, and I even did that at the bottom. So there's 3 wire guardians going there. But then on this one, you end up with something that looks like this. And you see how the sides are not the whole side. So all I did here was I just made a little triangle and I left the other side undone so I can show it again. But I just put these 5mm jump rings into the 2 seed beads, and then I just linked them together, and that's all I did. And I'm going to do the same thing over here and add some of the chain that's also called out in the handout and use that as my way to connect it. Maybe put an embellishment on there. If you want to do the pendant with a charm, you might want to grab some charms. Any charm will do. I have this little one left from the pack that I used. So I'm going to probably use that one today. And again, that one is just to go on the bottom there. So sky's the limit. Use what you've got, use what you like, go shopping, see something you like and pick it up. For the thread, you're going to use Wildfire is probably the easiest. You can use any kind of like a solid beading thread, something strong, something that can give you some structure. That's going to help a lot, especially with things like the pendant and the wave, because those are going to benefit from holding their shape a little better. So for me, I'll probably use black today, but you can use any color you'd like. And I'm using the 0.006. And I'm going with that because we're going through some 11s, size 11 seed beads. So handy there. Size 10 beading needle will work out great. You'll need some scissors. And at the end, when we're putting on jump rings, you might need some chain nose pliers unless you have one of those like jump ring rings. And that's pretty much it. So let's just dive in. As far as how much thread to cut, that's usually the first question we try to remember. And on this one, the answer is it depends what you're making. If you want to make this whole bracelet and even the diagonal one, you're going to end up needing quite a lot. You're going to need to add thread more than a couple times. I think on this one, I probably added thread twice. And it just depends how long of a length you like to work with. So I always tell folks, just cut a wingspan. If you're doing the pendant, you don't need as much, maybe 45 inches or so. Okay. And so I'm going to just cut comfortable working length for me, just for our demo. And again, I'm using these really nice scissors. I put these in all of my handouts because they cut the Wildfire thread just really, really nicely. And I'm going to grab really quick a pair of chain nose pliers. And all I'm using these for right now is just a way to make it easier to thread my needle. We start almost every class this way because threading needles can be tricky. And so if you flatten it with the chain nose plier, you'll be able to get that needle threaded easier. And it should go right through for you. Go ahead and just bring through about like 5 to 7 inches and fold it over. If you're working with a really long strand, you can fold over more. And now I'm going to grab some colors. And for today, I was just thinking what would be easiest to see is probably not our original palette. This is a gorgeous palette, but they're very close in color. So I thought I'd grab something a little brighter and we can work with that. And let's see how this looks. Maybe I was using this, but that's a little close. So I'm gonna grab some yellow. So there's my size 11 and there's my size 8. And feel free to use any colors you've got, anything you have handy that you like. And that will work out great. Okay. So what we're going to do first is build what is it's a starting row and it's pretty much even count. The only difference between what you're used to seeing with starting one of these kind of stitches is at the very bottom, we're going to throw a size 11 in there. And that's really just like a turn indicator. For me, it tells me which side is my front and back. And it also, when you got the design worked out, one of the questions I got was, can I just use another size 8 seed bead in a different color? And yeah, you can totally do that. But when your bracelet is finished, everywhere you see one of these little 11-Os, it would be a big bead. Stitch will totally still work, but it'll be a big bead there. And so what you get is a more lacy, maybe raggedy edge versus something a little muted with a smaller bead. So the reason I got asked that question was the person was working with delicas, and the delicas are a beautiful way to do these. That's often how the leaves are made. If you've seen those leaves that come together, and they just work with another size 11 right there on the edge. So that works too. Feel free to try that. This way for me personally helped me learn it. So that's why I thought I'll teach it this way too, because it made it clear for me to see, especially up here. It reminded me of my decreases. And so let's just dive in. What we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and string the first 9 S8. And don't worry, we'll do this a few times because it's the same stitch throughout the whole thing. So we're going to show it a lot. I'll go slow. So there's my 9. And then I need 1 S11. Bring that down and leave a tail. Leave a tail that's long enough for you to work your clasp. So something like 10 inches or so is probably pretty good. All right, and so now we're just going to work back up. As with all peyote stitch, this is our row 1 and 2, right? Now we're going to work back up, creating row 3. So let's pick up another size 8. And we're going to go ahead and skip the first S11 here, size 11, and then just come up through the next size 8 seed bead. And the trick that I like to do for getting things to sit side by side, they're not going to be perfect because they're different sizes, but I'll just set my needle down for a second, keep holding the tail, and then just pull it apart. And you'll get this little pop. And that really helps me out. And don't worry about what direction it's facing right now. Often when you're working this stitch, it's going to spin on you with every new row. But then when you come back down, you pick up the up bead that is the size 8. And I'll show that a bunch of times. For now, just get that to pop in this position in whatever direction. If it pops to the left, that's great. That's where you want it. If it doesn't, keep going. Worry about it later. All right, so we're going to pick up another size 8. Skip the next size 8 in your row. And then go through the one after that. So it's going to be the same mantra of picking up a bead and skip a bead, go to the next bead. And I'm using that trick again, where I just pull the working and tail thread apart to get it started. And same thing again. Let's get one more. Skip the next bead, and then go through the one after that. And then pull those working and tail threads apart. So far, so good. I'm getting something that looks like that. And these are round seed beads, so they're not going to lock in place exactly side by side. They're going to look a little bit organic. It's just all part of the style. So skip the next one. You're going through the one after that. And Cindy in the chat is mentioning stop bead. Stop beads are great too. I think everyone's got a certain style. I've developed a love for this style, but I think the stop bead way works great too. So it's definitely one of those things you would want to try and see which one you like more. But a stop bead would be on your tail before you string everything, right? I just find it easier to just add a bead, skip a bead, and then I just pull them apart. And that way it's really, really tight. And you know, it's kind of spinning on me and it's doing all that, but I can just get my next row in there and straighten all that out. So far, this is what we've got. And you can see we've got 4 up beads. And that's going to be how many we add for every new row. Okay, so that's rows 1, 2, and 3. And forgive me, I'm just going to close my window there because on cue, the leaf blowers are about to start. My neighbors get their yard done at the same time every week, and it happens to be like during our class. So I always get a chuckle out of that. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and do a turn. So this is going to be our first decrease. So stick with me here and don't sweat it because we're going to do this more than once. And we can maybe even switch colors, you know, all that. What I'm going to do now is decrease. So it's kind of not a true decrease. It's like a faux decrease because we're just switching to a size 11 when we make our first peyote turn. It just kind of looks like one. So I should really say that it's not a real decrease, but it has that look, right? And in the stitch diagram, what you'll see is we just did that. We just added that little size 11 and we went through the next up bead. So now we're going to just add 4 and then go in through here. And then we're going to do our first increase. So let's just do this part for now. Just get our next 4 size 8 in the right spot. So here's size 8 seed bead. And we're just going to skip and go through the next up bead. You're skipping the down bead, going through the up bead. Same thing. All right. So just pick up a bead, go through that next up bead, just like good old even count peyote stitch always looks like. It's going through those up beads. And I'm going to do a little tightening here. I'm going to put my thumbnail here and just tighten it up so it looks nice and easy to see. And there you go. So what you have is an 11 on each of these ends. And that's what we've got done so far. And here we are for the next increase, or in this case, it's our first increase. I'm going to show how it's drawn with the disclaimer that you can pick up the beads in different order and it'll still work. So in the handout, I show us picking up the size 8, then the size 11, and then one more size 8. So you're picking up an 8, an 11, and an 8. Bring that down to meet the rest of it. And what we're going to do from here is we're going to go back up through the first size 8 we strung. And when we're doing that, we'll try to keep it as close as we can to the rest of the work. So I'm skipping this one, and I'm skipping the 11, and I'm just going through back in the opposite direction. That first size 8 we picked up. And at the moment, it's going to look a little bit loose. One of the tricks I use to get it to be tighter is I'll pinch one of the beads here at the bottom. So I'm pinching the size 8 right now. Sorry, I dropped it. And then just pull. And what'll happen is it'll just tighten up a little bit. The other way you could get it to be a little tighter toward the bead that you're connecting it to is you go through the next bead and then come back out of it before you make the turn. But it can be, I'll show that on some subsequent rounds because it can be a little confusing. But all we did is we went back through the first 8 we strung and just tightened it by pinching these beads here while we pulled this thread. And so now you've got this little extra set of up bead, right, at the bottom of your work. And that's the nutshell of how this is done 100%. So we'll just do this a bunch more times, and then that's literally the whole technique. So I'm going to pick up another up bead and finish this row back up. And so all I'm doing now is picking up a bead and going through what was my next up bead here. And when you do that, everything down here just snugs up even more. You can tighten it if you want. It's going to look just kind of like that. First couple times you do this, don't sweat it. It's going to be a little wonky looking. It may not sit as mine is sitting. It's just kind of like with knitting and crochet, you develop a way to hold the position of things that kind of encourages them to go where you want them to, but they don't naturally do that all the time. But the cool thing is you can fix it, and I'll show you how. So right now I'm just adding an up bead, going through the next up bead, just getting here to the top. All right, this is where having those 11s helps you to understand. So when I first tried to learn this stitch, I had a same size bead here, and I was constantly picking up another bead and going through it because it's the next up bead, right? But this is a decrease, and so in order to do that, our little faux decrease, we're going to pick up an 11 now, and instead of going through here, we're going to turn early. So this is a true decrease at this point because we did not go through our last up bead, right? If we'd continued on, pick up a bead, go through the next up bead. So the size 11 can help you visualize that better than if you had the same size bead up there. And that's why I was thinking, yeah, it would be kind of good to keep that in the instructions. So hopefully that made sense. From here, I'm going to do one more set of rows down and up, and then just go right back and start all over again. And while I'm doing that, just think about colors. If you like the red, if you want me to switch the red, I can do that. No matter which color, it seems it kind of blends together, right? And so here's my next up bead. I picked up an 8/0, went through the next 8/0. Picking up another 8/0. Go through the next one. 8/0 through the next one. And 8/0 through the next one. There's my 4 beads. And so that's basically the ribbon stitch. That's the whole way to make the ribbon bracelet. We'll do another increase here. So let's do an 8/0, 11/0, and an 8/0. Slide those down to meet. And then we want to skip the 8/0 at the 11/0, go back through the 8/0. And so this, I'm just kind of holding it here to see how it's loose. You want to just pinch it and pull. And so now I've got something that looks a little bit wonky like that. So let's just pinch these beads here and pull tight. And then you'll get a very wonky looking increase, which gets a lot cleaner when you come back with the back pass row. And so mine's not spinning on me. It's keeping that 11/0 to the left, which is where I want it. But let's pretend that it's spun on me and it kind of went this way, in case that happens to somebody. So let's make it do that. If you get something that looks like this and it's bothering you, but it just won't fix, don't worry about it. Keep going. Pick up another 8/0 and finish the row back up. So we know our next up bead is going to be this one. And there it's popping in the wrong direction now. So that's good. I want to show that. Keep going up. Let's keep adding a new 8/0 through the next up bead 8/0. Okay. And then when you get here, we still have this 11/0 is an up bead, but we're not going to use it. We're going to pick up another 11/0 and turn early and come back through that last up bead we just added. So there's our next step down. And now I'm going to go down to the bottom here and show how to fix this wonky spinny thing. So just picking up an 8/0, finishing regular peyote stitch here. Okay, and now I'm back here, and I know I want to keep that 11/0 to the left. So go ahead and just go through the 8/0. Pick up your next bead, go through the 8/0. Boom, it's fixed. So you don't even have to worry about what side that 11/0 pops out on. And when you start going fast, you'll just want to keep going. All right, and so I'm assuming there's boats out there to stay on the course and show it again. So I'm going to start over, but let's see, as far as colors, I'm going to switch to maybe like a purple and keep the yellow out, but maybe we'll use a purple color. Easier to see. Cindy's comment's funny. Yeah, we've all been there, Cindy. The beads, they don't always do what we want, right? I have to kind of encourage them to do so. Oh, and Kathy, I think I definitely did not invent the stitch. Like the technique to do this, honestly, the first time I ever saw it was in that flower earring. I don't know if you guys have ever seen, it's like a peyote stitched flower. Sorry, flower leaf. I'm calling it a flower. It's a leaf. I saw one with a bunch of leaves around a flower recently, which was a very stunning design, but it's a technique you often see done with delicas because they are, they snap together in that little, you can make patterns and now that we've taught this, maybe we can do one of those. They're a little tricky because they, what they are is they're basically a stitch that looks like that. You keep doing this, you do one of the turns, and then you bring these together like that. and it would be a little longer, right? And you get this beautiful leaf look. And so that's where I first saw something kind of like this, but then the possibilities really, they're endless for what you can do. Like you could turn it into so many things. So cool. I didn't even show the ring. You can make a ring. So many things. All right, so I'm just going to start over with the same counts. And so what I'm going to do is pick up those 9 seed beads. There's 6 here, 7, 8, 9. Make sure I got that. And then 1 size 11. There we go. And then just slide that down again, leave in a tail depending what you plan to do with that tail. Maybe 10 inches will work. And so you've got 9 size 8 seed beads and 1 size 11. And you just pick up another size 8 seed bead. And then skip the 11. And then go through the next size 8. And when you do that, just pull that through. I always set down my needle for this first one and then just pull them. And you'll get that little pop where that bead is going to sit to the side next to the 8-0. And don't worry if it's not perfect, because the beads are definitely, they're round, so they're going to settle in different ways every time, but it'll still work. So here's my next one. And I'm going to skip the next 8-0 and go through the one after it. Just do that one, the same thing as before, hold it tight. Just do that a few more times. Skipping the next one, go through the one after that. And pull. And this is the way I usually start all my peyote. But you can also use a 2-needle method too. And there you go. So there's the first rows. Help that one a little bit. All right. And so once you've got that, this is our starting decrease, which is, kind of technically not a real decrease, but we're making it look like one by using a smaller bead. But really, we're just picking up a bead, going through the next up bead, just like we would for a regular peyote design. So just kind of like that. And now 8-0s from here on. 8-0 into your next up bead. Into the last up bead. All right, so now I have this. And tighten both sides there. And we need to do an increase. So we'll do an 8-0, 11-0, 8-0. Those, and bring that down to meet the rest of the work. And then I'm just going to skip the 8-0 and the 11-0 there. You go back through this one. Let me show you a little trick. What we've been doing so far is just going through this bead, and it's movable. And holding it tight can be tricky. If that's challenging for you, go ahead and go through those 2 beads. I know that's not where we're headed, but if you do that, it gives you something to stabilize into. And again, I'm not worrying about what direction that 11-0 is sticking in. But now that's a super tight stitch. The only thing I need to do is come back out of those last 2. But for some reason, that can be helpful for some. So give it a try if you like it. And all that did was it just made those sit really close. From here, I'm going to pick up my 8-0 and go through my next up bead. And this one, see my 11-0 is facing the right, and I really want it to face the left, but I'm going to fix it later. Just keep going. My tail got caught, sorry. And now here's a true decrease. We are not going to go through that up bead. We're just going to go and make an early turn and using an 11-0 to do that. So there's that first stepping down turn. And let's bring on these 8-0. Keep going down. And now we're at that spot where we need to join and fix that little wonky turn. So super easy. I've got my next 8-0 bead and I'm just going to go through the 8-0. And it just puts it right back where you want it to be. Yeah, this is a really fun technique. And so that is basically how to do the ribbon. And let's finish one more increase on that just to see it one more time. Here's the 3. Bring that down so that they meet the end. Skip the last 2 you strung there and go through the first one you strung. And I just pinch it, and then sometimes I'll grab the 8-0 bead and use that as a way to kind of force a turn to kind of get it to sit flat. There we go. So both ways work. If you find it easier to just go through a couple beads when you're doing that tight little turn there, then that works too. But the goal is to kind of get it to sit as close as you can. But don't worry too much if it's not perfect. You know, you just come back and fix it on the way on the back pass. And there we go. So you just keep carrying on. So let me get to the top here and check in on. So we're about halfway through and we're in a good spot. So I'm going to start showing the turn. And this would be the turn using counts that are on the bracelet. And so what we've done so far is the ribbon. We've been building this little ribbon stitch. Looks like that. Let's grab the other one. There's the red one we were doing. And they're both pretty much in the same spot. So if you want to just keep going, go ahead and keep going and you'll make your ribbon. And then I have one here right at the end. I'm going to show how to put those wire guardians on it. But if you like doing the bracelet and you want to start making a turn, I'm going to show how to do that next. So the first thing I want to mention before I show the turn is use your 11-0 as your count marker. So what I mean by that is so that you can make sure you're you have the same amplitude every time. What you want to do is have the same number of 11-0 in your side counts. And so for me, I went with 4. But you don't have to. You can turn it 3, you can turn it 2. The trick is just to keep it consistent with what you did last time, and you'll get a good wave. But you could make a wave with different heights too, and it would still work. So in order to stick with what I did here, I'd want to make one more row, complete set of up and down row. So let's see here. Here's number 3. Let's keep going until we have that turn. And also I should show in the handout where that is in case anyone's looking for it. We're going to build until we have 4. And then there's a spot here where you turn and build back up, and then you do an increase. If that makes any sense. It's kind of interesting, but you want to come back down and do a turn that way. Well, I'll show that when we get there. But the short way to describe it, I think the best, most understandable way to think about it is you stop increasing on the down pass after the 4th 11-0 is added. So right now I only have 3 11-0s, so I know I need to do one more set. That's if I'm going for 4. So here's my next increase and get to see this again. Bring that up. Just going to join it. Help that be a little tighter. So there's our increase. And let's work back up.
Danielle?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Carmi.
Hey.
Just when you finish this fourth row, will you lay it down on your finished piece? Kelly would love to just see it where you're stopping, so she has a better way of visualizing it.
Let's see. So the finished ribbon or the finished
Yes,
wave?
the finished wave.
Finished wave. Okay. So here's the wave. And right now what I've got is that. Sorry, let me get back center. And what I'm going to do down here, well, so I've only got 311 here, right? And you can see here, I want to have 4. So I'm about to do the turn to add that 4th one and come back down here. And then I'm going to show where instead of doing another increase, we just keep that as a flat even with no increase, no decrease, and we make that turn with an 8-0. Just to give you a flat edge, which is nice to have for if you're going to do like a wire guardian, for example, but let me get there and show you. So here we're doing the same thing for now. Same thing we've been doing. We've got the 11-0. Just bring that down. So there's our 4. You know, I've got 4 here. So now we know it's time. It's time to do our turn. If you like that count, you can, of course, I know I've said a couple times, but you could absolutely change that count. It can be 3, it can be even just 2. Could be more. The bigger the wave you make, the less stable. You know, your stitch will be it'll move a lot more, but will still work in theory. So far all I'm doing is just regular peyote, just picking up a bead, going through the next up bead. Okay, so here's where we are here. And let me show it again one more time here. Be easier on the not clasp side. We're basically there. And all we have to do now is this turn here. And so to do that, and this isn't the only way, this is just the way that I thought looked cool, but you can just go ahead and pick up another 8-0. And keep in mind what we were going to do now is an increase. If you're doing the ribbon, you just do another increase. We're skipping that and then just doing a regular good old even count peyote turn with the same 8-0 bead. Just because I like the look. You could turn with an 11 if you want. I just thought this looked a little flatter. So you get that. Now I'm going to finish this up. And when we get up there, so we just did that. We're going to finish up 1, 2, 3. Then we'll add our 4. And there is an increase here. So when we get here, we're going to be exiting from the last 8-0 up bead. We're not going to go through that 11-0, which is technically the up bead, right? In that row. We're not going to go through it. We're going to just do an increase. Same way we've been doing the increases the whole time. We're just going to do it here. And what it's going to do is it's going to place an 11-0 adjacent. And again, if this spin thing happens to you here, don't worry about it, because when you come along, you go back down, we do this here, we start doing decreases. Again, you get a chance to fix that by picking up that 8-0 and making sure it puts that 11-0 right to the left. And then you just build up another 4 on the side and you've got the first one of your wave. So let's go through and add those. So I'm just right now just adding 8-0 into the next up bead until I get to the top. And by the top, I mean I'm going to where I have the last 8-0 up bead. And I brought a bead through it. So that's where I am right now. And it's just time to do an increase. So let's pick up an 8-0, 11-0, 8-0. Let's bring that down. And let's go back through the first 8-0 we just added. And it looks like my 11 is going the way I want it to, but if yours doesn't, don't worry. We can fix it on the way back. And this is just a regular peyote, 8-0 through the next up bead. I do really like how everything tightens up though as you add the next ones. Every row fixes the one before it. And it looks like I skipped a bead, guys. Anybody spot that? I skipped an up bead. Need one more. Last up bead here. So that's what we've got. Our first turn is starting to take shape, starting to form. I'm going to turn and get an 11 out to do that turn. And so this is at this point, a faux decrease. Get like that. And I'm just traveling now, just traveling back up with an 8-0 through each up bead. Here's that chance to fix it if your 11-0 was turned. Or no, sorry, you're going to grab that 8-0 here. This was the increase we just did here. Grab that, and then go ahead and tighten it. And mine's got a little height difference between my beads, but that's what you're going for there. And we need to do another increase here on the top side. Let's do that. Let's grab another 8-0, 11-0, an 8-0 bead here. And then just slide that down and go back through the first 8-0 you strung in the opposite direction of that thread exiting. So you want to get it to just kind of sit like that for you. And we're going to pick up more 8-0s. There's our next up bead. It's spinning a little, but it's okay. Okay, so here we are. We're down at the bottom. We've got our last 8-0 up bead, but we're not going to go through our 11-0 up bead. We're going to turn, pick up 11-0, and go back through that last 8-0 you just added from the previous row. So that's a true decrease there. I'm just going to carry on with the row. And so from here, we need another increase. It's going to do another 8-0, 11-0, and 8-0. Bring those down so that they touch the bead there. Come back through just the 8-0 bead. And sometimes they just pop into place. I don't even know how. You don't always do that, but that one was really nice. I liked that one. And that'll happen for you guys too. You'll get into like a flow when you're stitching that it gets faster and everything just starts looking really, really good. There's that. Let's do our turn. Again, true decrease here. We're skipping an up bead, right? That 11-0 is our next up bead. We're skipping it and turning with a new 11-0. Go that way. Almost to the end, and then we have a pendant almost done. Here's an increase coming up. Got these three here. Bring that down. That one didn't work out as good. Let's try here. Here we go. Just getting it to sit as close as I can. And let's carry on with our 8/0s to the next up bead. And there we are. That row's good. Here's our next decrease turn, 11/0. Let's start adding our 8. All right, so let's take a look at what we've got. We've got 4 on each side, 4 here and 4 there. And so at this point, if you were doing the wave, you would want to do that same step again that's described in figure 7, but you'd be doing it from the top. And I'm going to show that just real quick, but see here how we did a turn and we added the size 8, and it's just basically a flat even count turn. You would need to do that from this position here if you're carrying on with the wave. So it would look like this. You'd pick up your next 8/0 and you would just put that there. And let me tighten that up a little bit. It's really loose. And you would just carry on with 8/0 all the way down. And you would do an increase when you get to the bottom here. So in a nutshell, the wave pattern is what we've got going here. Let me do this. It's a good idea to do this layout. Actually, I like that. That's how to do the bracelet. If you like that wave. If you just wanted to stop with a pendant, we are already finished with it. So we just got to where our thread was exiting from the top. And what I'll do here is let's go back and pull that out. Oop, that didn't work. One of the best teachers of seed beading has told me, always take your needle off and just pull those beads out. But I always try because I'm stubborn. There we go. Okay. So from here is where you put on a wire guardian if you did a pendant. Now this has different counts than my pendant. This one has the 4 start. On this pendant, I actually only started with 3. So when I strung these beads, I didn't have those beads on it. If that makes sense. So I basically strung 7 instead of 9, and then 1 11/0, and then I worked it back up. And that just gives you a different size edge, right? So an edge with 3 versus an edge with 4. But as far as turning up number 4 11s, that was the same. A little taller. And counts like these, they look completely different with different beads. So if you tried it with a smaller bead, you might find that 3 is just way too thin for a pendant and you need to do 6 or 4 or 6. This is a really good size for a bracelet, I thought, especially for the ribbon bracelet. And let's get some wire guardians. So we're getting a little tight on time and I want to at least show that. But these are a regular size wire guardian, and they're inside of the handout. The part number for them is. Okay, so let's grab one of these. I'm just going to get my needle back on really quick. So super easy, guys. From here, what you'll do is bring down your wire guardian. And right now my thread's exiting from my 8/0. It'll be like that for you on both sides, your starting side and your end side. And then just come around the rainbow. And I like to pinch my wire guardians like this to keep the thread in the well. Wire guardians have a little kind of like a trough at the top to keep the thread to hide in. And then go through that 11/0. And it really does sit nicely like that. And I like to reinforce them. I'll do a turn first just through the 8/0, just to come up like that. Make sure you're getting through the wire guardian, through that channel there, through the well. And this time when I come down the other side, I'm going to go ahead and continue on through some other beads. And it's not heavy, so I think twice or 3 times for reinforcement is great. And I'll maybe do a turn here. Back down through those same beads. And use that same trick, or just kind of pinch the top, keep that wire guardian's thread in there. Everything looks good. Go ahead and weave down. So I tend to have more working thread left than tail. And I used my working thread to weave all the way down here and pop another wire guardian on the bottom. And that's what I did here. In the same way. So you just got to have the thread brought from here down to here. And then just add that wire guardian. But I reinforce through these, then reinforce through 2 more beads up, maybe 3. Add your charm at the end when you're all set. And then just use the tail thread on the side to do the same thing here. To get your wire guarding on. So that's the pendant. And then if you want to end the ribbon bracelet, that's exactly the same. For the ribbon bracelet, what you'll have is you'll have an ending where your tail threads through an 8/0 like that. And you'll just do that same stitch I just showed you to put your wire guardian on there. Same thing on that side. And at the end, you get something that looks like that. And the cool thing about this design with the the Siver-Lined gold is that it kind of blended in with my wire guardian. So it looks like it's all one continuous metal piece. So I thought it looked really cool. And I embellished it with something a little cute there. All right, so if you're making the bracelet, the wave bracelet, the ambitious one, when you get down to this part and you're like, oh, how do I finish this thing? There's thousands of ways. I came up with something super simple, and I'm just going to quickly show how I did that. But you could also buy those really pretty bars. There's a couple different versions. There's slide tubes. If you have the little slide tubes, I think Beading Mat makes them that go over. You can use those with Peyote by putting a little 11/0 in between each of those. You can stitch on a half moon brass blank, which is another really beautiful way to do it. The thickness of this, in case you're buying a finding and you want to know what finding to buy, take a look at, if you're making the same counts as me, take a look at findings that are about a little over 1/2 inch, depending on where you're going to connect them and stitch them through. There's also those tubes that have the loops on them. Those are really cool, and those will work great too. But using what we already have on the mat, let's go ahead and grab a bunch of jump rings. So I'm going to need to get 5 of these. There's 4 and 5. And go ahead and get some chain nose and some bent nose. So I have a pair of bent nose pliers here, just easier for me to do jump rings with. Here's my chain nose from earlier that we were using to flatten our thread. Get your jump ring and find the seam. Open that up. And it doesn't matter which beads you pick up, but I tend to focus on trying to make it be in the same row as where I put my first one. It looks like what I did is I grabbed the first up bead on this side. So I'm going to grab the first up bead over here. Try to match what I did a little bit. Let's fold them over and see where they're going to connect. Actually, when you're wearing it, it might make sense for me to maybe work a little closer to this side. So let's do that. First up bead on this side, on the decreasing side. And if you're using the same jump rings as me, let me bring those back. 5mm. These are 22 gauge. A 22 gauge is going to go through an 8/0 seed bead. If you have jump rings, forgive me, that are thicker, like 20 gauge, this might not work. So just a little warning there. But if you're using the same ones that are in the handout, they're going to work great for you. And you could always make this with 22 gauge wire too. You can make little jump rings for yourself that will work. Or you can even make a connector. Something I didn't get a chance to finish trying was I thought about making a little connector with wire that kind of weaves down, comes out and does a little bar and then like weaves down and comes out. And for that, I had some wire sitting next to me that I was going to try. So from here, skip the next up bead and put your jump ring of the up bead after it. So like that. So first up bead, skip an up bead, go through the next one. Close that up. And let's grab another one. And I'm going a little fast on the jump rings, guys. Sorry, I'm assuming everyone's seen this lateral motion to open and close. I added that one to the top of one of them. Get one more. I think these are connected. There we go. There we go. To the other one. All right, so far what I have is jump rings into the first up bead and the third. And then I threw jump rings on the ends of those. And then I'm going to get one more jump ring. Connect those two. And so that's how I did that little join. On this side, that join included a lobster claw. So I put a lobster claw right there. So that was done before I closed this jump ring. For this side, I'm going to go and grab some of this paperclip chain. Just really quick. Flush cutters here. I'm going to add about an inch of length. So let's go 2, 3. Cut maybe there. Strong chain, guys. Okay. And there we go. So the bells and whistles I would put on this, I would put little dangles at the end of my chain to give it some weight. I would just go to town making it really pretty. You could even put a charm. Like I didn't get a chance to use my charm yet, but how cute would that look right there? So after all that stitching, it can be kind of fun to work with some jump rings and some tools. And there you go. So there's all these different ways you can finish them. I didn't show the ring. The ring is super, super easy. We have done a class on peyote stitch rings before. We did it way back in the day. It was like back in 2020. It's the same process. It's a zipper stitch. And so to do a zipper stitch, all you got to do is take the ends of make a ribbon that's the length of a ring you want. And you can use lots of tools for ring sizing. And then just bring them together and zipper stitch. Up bead to up bead, like that. So you want to connect those and connect those. And it looks a little wonky right now, but when you stitch them together, it looks pretty good. And you'll have one area where it just jets up just a little bit like that, but nobody's going to notice that. If you really didn't like it, you could leave that last 11 off and it would look a little flatter, but yeah. So those are 4 ways you can make 4 pieces of different jewelry with the same stitch repeated over and over again. All right, so
Danielle,
right on the button there.
right on the button. I didn't want to interrupt you because everything you discussed that you definitely wanted to share, you got through. So that was great.
We made it.
The one thing I just wanted to ask is if you could just show the rainbow. Just lift it up one more time. I think there's 1 or 2 people who may want to attempt it. So maybe if you just leave it there for a second, they can just take a screenshot.
Sure, let me put the beads out for you. So I used a red, orange, yellow, green, blue. So there's my red in 8/0. And I went with orange for my side bead.
Yep.
That's the 11/0 there on the side. And then that's a yellow. This was my green. It's the emerald, you know, and the blue was the opaque light blue, pale blue. And then that nice lavendery purple chalk. So that's the rainbow there that I used.
That's
Again,
great,
all
Danielle.
yellow.
That was the only question I had left to ask you before we ended.
Yeah, this was a fun one. And the counts are the same. So it's that same start with 9, and then your 10th bead is that 11-0. And those counts, and then just every other color. And then when you're going down, the bead you're coming out of is the bead's color you add, and going back up, the color you're going into is the color you add. You'll see it though. You'll see it as you're stitching it. Yeah. And then of course, if anyone has any questions, I can do like probably post a little reel or something. So if I get enough requests, I always do stuff like that for you guys. And also our Facebook group. We have a Facebook group where people post lots of questions and just beautiful things that they've made. So if you're already a member, awesome. If you're looking for it, the best way to find it is go to blog.johnbead.com and then just click I'd like to join the Facebook group. And so that's the best way to, so it's got kind of a long name. So, and Facebook can be hard to find stuff. So yeah, and then if you want to tag us in social media, please tag #MakeItWithMichaels. And you can hashtag John Bead, and we love seeing your work. So with that, I will just wish you a really great weekend and happy beading. And we'll see you guys next week for our, we're doing some brick stitch next week. It'll be really fun. Gonna make some flower earrings, some flower studs. So be here for our Flower Power July class next Friday at 2 p.m. Central. All right, bye guys.